This is Clarence. He is 1 year old today. These are his friends. Like all babies, they were born with 100 billion neurons, nearly twice as many as an adult, even though their brains are half the size. Their brains are growing faster than any other part of their bodies. 60% of their metabolism is being spent on growing their brains. By 3, their brain volume will have doubled. But those 100 billion neurons will not stay forever. As the children move, play, and learn, these neurons are being connected so their brains circuits are half the size. Circuits that govern emotions, motor skills, and speech. The circuits that are used get reinforced. The circuits that are neglected get pruned away. What remains is a basic structure that will influence the rest of their life. It is how they will see the world. It will influence their thinking, feelings, their joys and fears. Most of how the world will seem, how they will fit, what they will do, will come from this brain. So if you want to change the world for the future, build the brain. Focus on these first 3 years. And in the first 3 years, parents make the difference.
Am I on? Hey, everyone. Welcome to another discussion. I'm here with Dr. Ray Lundy and Krystal Allen. Hey, guys.
Hey.
So I'll just do a quick introduction of both of you, just so everyone knows. First off, I'm Josh Saby. I was the director of American Tragedy. Dr. Ray Lundy, I actually got to attend some of her lectures at NCCU, and we were able to interview her. She actually featured in the documentary briefly, which was neat. And she is a mental health advocate. She works as the Associate Vice President for Student Health Counseling and Wellness at Wiley College. And Krystal Allen is the founder and CEO of Krystal Allen Consulting. She's also, I just learned, a doctoral candidate at Columbia University, where she is working on her dissertation. Very excited to be here with them. They're both deeply involved in the field of mental wellness. And so we're going to be talking about it today. And so the first question for both of you, and we can just take one at a time, is what did you feel like the biggest takeaway was from American Tragedy? Maybe we can start with Krystal, and then we'll go to Ray.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for providing both Dr. Lundy and myself the opportunity to engage in this conversation. And I would say the biggest takeaways for me were, number one, the importance of prevention in general, and just preventative measures, particularly for institutions that regularly engage with young people. I think about early childhood centers, I think about K-12 schools, and also institutions of higher learning as well. So I think there's a lot to be said about what are we doing to be far more proactive than reactive. And I think the second major takeaway is the importance of increasing access to information and really building people's capacity and their awareness deeply for parents, but also for all of us.
You know, and I'm excited to hear more of your thoughts on this, particularly because you have so much experience with early education and with schools. You were a principal of a school. You consult schools across the world, and you told me, I can't remember where, but then multiple continents. So that'll be really interesting to talk about. Ray Lundy, let's hear what you thought the most important takeaway was.
I absolutely echo what future Dr. Allen has said, and I agree that access and awareness, those are two things that really stood out to me. I think that the more we are aware of what to look for, and the more we grant access to parents and families from all spectrums, I think that we will allow ourselves to better recognize, as well as better support when there is a need. I think what also stood out to me was this idea of that these types of situations can be very isolating, and I think support and being aware of how we are a community and a family, and that if we are able to better support one another, that we can move through such tragedies.
Awesome. Well, yeah, well, great. Thank you both for that. And I want to start our conversation just with a clip from American Tragedy. This is actually a clip where Ray's in it, and it's in the credits. But I think it's actually a very important part of the film. So just give me a second to pull that up.
Time this year, I'm going to try to do a little something different. I'm going to try to incorporate into my class some wellness, stress coping strategies.
This idea that mental health only applies to people who are sick, that it's other people's issue, that is a notion and a narrative that we need to let go.
Back in the day, because I've been in education, for 20 plus years, we called them kind of soft skills, but now there's so much research and data to back up that when you address their social emotional needs, then their academic scores go up, their behavior issues in the classroom go down, which is more time on task for the teachers. And so why not teach these skills to everybody?
Okay, so I just kind of want to start right there just with the school question of what is the importance of addressing the social emotional needs of children in school, like specifically school?
I would definitely just say that it's deeply important. It's just as important as academic achievement, and yet the way in which our federal and also state and local policies are constructed, there's often an overemphasis on academic performance, more so than there is this deep concentration and attention to detail around the total wellness of our children. And so, I think that it is very commendable for school communities who lean into, number one, clearly defining and naming social emotional wellness as a priority, and giving it equal weight in terms of having an explicit curriculum by which they provide social emotional lessons so that students, even as early as 3 and 4 years old, can begin to develop a sense of self-awareness, a sense of social awareness, a sense of emotional management, and the ability to manage and engage in healthy relationships with others. I think that too often the provision in school settings of social emotional discourse often is in reaction to students manifesting some form of what would be considered major misbehaviors. And so at that point, often our children are crying out for help. And those behaviors that we're noticing are manifestations of deep forms of trauma that they've, experienced or hurt or lost, feelings of depression, anxiety, etc. So I think the more we as a society, but especially we as educational practitioners, can shift our mindsets to understand that when we say that we care for the whole child, it can't just be lip service. That caring for the whole child means that our policies and our practice and our funding have to support it. Right now, there are nearly 14 million students across the entire US throughout public schools who are in schools that have police officers, but have no social workers, have no counselors, have no psychologists. And so when you think about the message that that sends and where we actually spend our money, our time, our dollars, et cetera, they don't align to the concept of valuing the whole child.
Yeah, and Ray.
I was going to say that I think you can't have academic success without mental wellness. I think simply put, even though we've treated the two as they're disparate, they're not. You bring your mental health with you wherever you go. And so by not paying attention to the mental well-being of our children, we are doing them a disservice. And I think we're doing ourselves as a society a disservice as well. I echo what Krystal is saying in terms of shifting the narrative. And I think part of shifting that narrative is being able to talk about it from less of a punitive perspective. So as Krystal mentioned, if we're doing these things in reaction to, if every time you're talking about mental health, it's when you see a problem happening, rather than saying we all have a spectrum of mental health, just in the same way you would go to see a physical doctor. So by shifting that narrative and having more of an integrated conversation, I think that's another that I think really would help shift the narrative is integration. And in the clip that you saw, Dr. Salim was sharing how essentially at North Carolina Central, we decided that we were going to integrate mental well-being into the work that they did in the classroom throughout the entire semester. And I think that that's a model, not just that's imperative, that was at the collegiate level, but as Krystal mentioned, 3, 4, 5, as soon as the child is able to, enter spaces where they're engaged in interpersonal connections with others, that's an opportunity for them to become more aware of their own emotional regulation process. And so integration is extremely important. And I definitely agree that we have to change this narrative.
Well, one thing that interested me when we talked with Dr. Salim was he didn't paint this decision to have social emotional sort of coaching as a sacrifice, like a give and take. Like he was sacrificing the academic. It was this was actually supporting. This is how the kids got better grades, how they did better. Or it was very much that they complement each other and help them excel.
Yeah, I think that's super important too, the approach. Research indicates that how a parent or a professor or a teacher, their view on the subject matter that they're sharing. So the fact that Dr. Salim was excited about it and that he welcomed me into the classroom, then that transferred to the students. And so the students didn't feel as though this mental well-being component was a negative addition to the course, but rather it enhanced the work that they were doing.
Can I add just like how critically important that last statement that Dr. Lundy shared from a standpoint of our identity markers, right? So when we think about how boys are socialized, when we think about how girls are socialized, the messages that they're told, when we think about the different messages that may be told even within different communities along racial and ethnic lines. And then on top of that, think about socioeconomic factors as well. I think there's something to be said about the fact that often there's a stigma that boys should not be verbal about their emotions, right? And when they are, that's seen to be something that is not normal, so to speak, for a boy. And for us to begin to change the narrative, it has to start there with breaking those like very traditional, archaic, erroneous, like narratives that girls should be the ones expected to more, to be more articulate about their emotions and their emotional, well-being, so that we normalize it, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the same thing is true then when we think about race. There are definitely deep stigmas around the pursuit of therapy and counseling in different communities of color. And so this idea that like, I don't need therapy, and therapy is for that person or this person, and it's seen as something that is deeply problematic, instead of normalizing the fact that we all need to examine ourselves, our histories, our trauma. We all need to engage in forms of healing. And then when I think about it in terms of class, I think the same thing is true. I think often when we are having conversations, at least in school settings, around mental health, it is often framed for students who are coming from low-income backgrounds. We're not necessarily prioritizing that conversation in the exact same way for students who are coming from affluent backgrounds. And then there's this assumption that because I have more wealth, everything is fine. Everything is fine.
And I think we saw that
saw
that in American Tragedy, right? Like for me, that was one of the earlier messages that stood out, is that there was this disbelief that somehow it happened in this community. And and I think, as Krystal is mentioning, that's the work of the destigmatization. I think our very initial comments tonight were about how we want to increase access and awareness. And I think this is where these are the types of conversations you have to have to say mental health, mental illness, it isn't, it doesn't discriminate by race. It does not discriminate by class. It does not discriminate, although we do at times discriminate, but I think the access to services and access to information regarding what it takes to be totally well, we have to continue to normalize, as Krystal is saying. I think, and that for me, I know we're probably going to get into speaking more specifically your questions around mental illness, but that to me, when you get there, I'm just going to be reiterating that point, that destigmatization, normalization, that those are the keys. And we can talk a little bit more about how do we do that. But I think unless we do that, we're going to keep seeing this cycle.
Definitely.
Within our school systems.
And one more thing I would add, y'all, that I didn't get to mention there is also geographic context. I work in a lot of rural spaces versus urban, and the way that those conversations happen in urban spaces versus rural, right? When we think about culture in that way, is also something to deconstruct.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me. So does it, from your perspective, is the answer to start treating all of these spaces the same? Is it to come up, like, not to assume that they don't need it, but to assume that everyone needs it? Or is it to treat them differently, sort of according to their needs? Does that make sense?
I think it's a both and. I don't think you can separate, right? I think as a clinician, I need to be aware of certain trends, perhaps, but I also need to be culturally competent enough to move in a way that is specific to the needs of my current client. So yes, I think we have to do the work of addressing our own implicit biases. I think we all, it's fair to say that we may make some assumptions about a child or a student that has a certain experience. I think, though, we have to be aware of that bias and work to challenge those biases so that we can say that this is an experience that can happen to any and all children, thus challenging ourselves to not treat them differently in the sense that they're not worthy of receiving support. But if we do treat them differently, it can be based on whatever specific need we have seen when we're working with them, not with some presumptuous notion that they may or may not have certain challenges. I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
It's a personal example that Krystal may be aware of. So Krystal and I met at Notre Dame. We both attended the University of Notre Dame, and I had the experience of being in the doctoral program for clinical psychology. And I was told during my first year in the doctoral program that I needed to retake a course that I'd already taken as an undergrad, because our Black students in the PhD program tended not to fare well in a certain statistics or math course. So to your question, there was this general assumption about what the experience had been for the Black students in the program. And that was presented to me as something that they thought would be of benefit, of assistance to me. But because they made that generalization, that actually triggered me to have a mental health response. It triggered anxiety for me. Rather than assessing my competency or my status individually to see what my level of performance might have been. So in that instance, taking information that was already, that what they thought to be well known, actually worked to trigger an emotional response for me in ways that happen oftentimes for students. And so I think what we're really saying is, while we can be aware and observant, what we don't want to do is to project any biases that we might have about someone's experience, ability, mental health, because what that may do is trigger them towards poor performance and poor functioning overall.
So are there other sort of unique challenges, that sort of intersectional challenges that people face that I might not be aware of, that other people might not be aware of, whether it's due to gender or race or anything? What are some of those challenges that people have in accessing, mental wellness? I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but whether it's professional help or just information, what are some of the challenges that get in the way of these people?
I think, Krystal, you've mentioned, or I'm gonna let you go ahead. You mentioned though the cultural component. That's where I was gonna say sometimes our cultural, we limit access to services because we think that we shouldn't need a service. So, or we should not talk about it because of, I guess that goes back to this idea of stigma. So we might observe certain behaviors. Give you another example. Certain behaviors or experiences that persons who identify as who may be experiencing homelessness or food insecurity. What I see and what research indicates is that much of what persons who are experiencing homelessness or food and as a result food insecurity, that there's significant mental health concerns happening there. But rather than treating the mental health concerns, what often happens and limits them from getting support that they need, we're looking at behaviors. And I imagine, or I know that happens in K through 12 experience as well. And Krystal, I'm sure you can attest to, you mentioned earlier about Black boys and maybe what or about boys in general and what boys experience. But I know statistically for African-American young men, behavioral wise, they may experience more verbal expression. They may present themselves as having more energy. And when that behavior is assessed, oftentimes that may be seen as a conduct issue versus if that is seen or it's seen as ADHD. So sometimes it's diagnosed or it's misdiagnosed or misperceived in both ways. So sometimes we over diagnose with mental illness and then under evaluate the perspective of contextual. So in the event that per se we are looking at someone's experience and they are behaving in ways that could be perceivably an impediment to instruction in the classroom, rather than treating that behavior, if we are more aware that perhaps there may be some mental health issues going on or concerns going on, then we might be able to better provide support or resources, and vice versa. Sometimes we are too quick to assume that there are mental health challenges going on, and then that can deter from students receiving the academic support that they need. So I think back to that question you asked, which was really good, we don't want to overgeneralize, because then there are people who are placed in categories that might limit their academic or their mental health access. We don't overgeneralize, but then also we don't want to take someone's specific experience and misdiagnose in a way that prevents them from getting what they need. So.
Awesome. Krystal.
Yeah, thank you. I would add a couple of different things from the early childhood and the K-12 perspective in terms of why there may be barriers to access to different supports. So number one would be funding and funding allocations. We tend to see differences in traditional public schools versus charter schools across the country. In traditional public schools, the school board tends to really approve an overall budget for a district, and therefore the superintendent and their cabinet or their central or district office team tend to set the budget priorities. And to what extent any type of mental health or social emotional supports, et cetera, are prioritized is really on the discretion of that particular administration, which often can be hit or miss. Whether or not that leader, being the superintendent and other senior leaders in those roles, whether they've been trained in their colleges of education and their leadership preparation programs and their communities of practice that they're a part of, to understand that it should be a priority. And so if they don't necessarily have that, worldview, it gets reflected in the agenda of the district in terms of there being an absence or limited funding allocated to it. What we tend to see in charter school contexts where the principals have a bit more autonomy over their budget is an increase in the amount of school social workers, because the principal and their teams can decide that we want a social worker or we want a psychologist full-time or we want whatever, and they have far less red tape in their way in order to prioritize that in the budget. Doesn't mean it happens across charter schools, because it doesn't, but you tend to see there being more autonomy with the practitioners on the ground doing the work to decide that and to therefore advocate for the presence of those professionals. I think the second piece that's really huge to note is often representation in the roles of caregivers and folks who are mental health professionals, folks who do administer and provide any type of social emotional supports in schools. Oftentimes affinity matters a lot. So we have a child who is in high school, and let's say they're trans, they're Black, they're from a low income background, and the professionals on the staff in no way mirror them in terms of sexual orientation, race, class. We tend to see there being less likelihood of those particular young people accessing those services. And so, no different than conversations in STEM around women needing to be more represented, conversations across the board in terms of Black and brown folks needing to be more represented. I think there's a real conversation to be had around how our professionals across schools even more reflective of the demographic of children that we're serving across, class, race, you name it. I think the third piece that I would name that tends to be, a barrier at times is that we don't give enough time in K-12 settings to these supports. We tend to provide them piecemeal. So we'll say, here's a plan, and this plan would encompass seeing a counselor 30 minutes once a month. What, like, you need far more than a 30-minute conversation once a month. And so often when we're constructing plans to support our students, they're not really holistic and ongoing and deep and substantive in the way that they need to be to really have enduring sustainable change for students. And so those are three things that I would name, that leadership matters, funding matters, representation matters, and really strategic and intentional planning matters.
Yeah. One thing that really stood out to me about what you're saying is that the people on the ground seem to value it. If they're the ones making the decisions, they're prioritizing it. And that suggests something that they see it as helping the kids. Whereas if it's a more top-down approach, their values might be, how the grades are coming off, or, they could have different values that push different protocol. And so it's just interesting that what you're seeing, and I don't know if there's studies or anything that suggested that people, that charter schools, when they're making the decisions, they're generally using more of these emotional and social teachers, and I'm not sure what all they're adding into their curriculum, but they're adding it into their curriculum at a higher rate. So that's really interesting to me. And I want to turn to a viewer's question here because I think it connects. And this is someone who is on the ground. They're going to be teaching a college course next year. They probably can't make decisions like what the school is going to do, but this is what they're asking. They're saying, my students are coming from all sectors of the social experience. This is already a remarkably stressful year for so many people. How can I care for their mental wellness as their instructor? And then this one, maybe Ray will be particularly interested in. He says, how can I care for my own? So let's start with Krystal, and then we'll go to Ray.
I think one piece of it is really creating space to honor their humanity, and the reality that at the end of the day, when we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people are stressed. They're afraid. We're living through a global pandemic, right? And so part of it is that, taking even set aside moments to just check in and ask, how are people doing? What do you need? How can we show up and be supportive to one another? I think goes a long way. Just the acknowledgement, I think the second thing that comes to mind is I'm seeing a lot of instructors, regardless of the context, curate resources very intentionally and provide them, to their students, all types of resources, literature, videos, support groups, affinity groups, all of these things. And so I think that being able to support students by curating resources is also incredibly helpful. And last but not least, I would also say that really leaning into displaying your own vulnerability, right? Like I think about what it meant for me to be a principal and stand in front of my children and really own my shortcomings, tell my own story, tell them when I was afraid. It spoke volumes, right? And so it's not, I think, always about fixing it necessarily, but it's really about how do we allow ourselves to walk on a journey alongside our students, so that we can navigate these times together. Because traditionally, this idea that the teacher needs to have all the knowledge and the answers should be thrown out to begin with. And so the reality is that it should be a mutually beneficial relationship in which I, as an instructor, I'm learning just as much from my students and the communities that they're coming from as they are also learning from me.
So I'm a big advocate of vulnerability, but I'm just curious, as a teacher, maybe even more so than a principal, is there a risk of losing some amount of authority, some amount of control in the classroom? I could imagine that could be a fear for people. What would you say to someone who's scared that if they're particularly vulnerable, that they would give up something?
It increases trust so much. I mean, like, I think about the years that I taught students, and this is across different grade levels, they honestly felt closer to me because they felt like there was an authentic relationship. They knew where I was from. They knew my economic, upbringing. They knew stories about my parents. They knew my hopes and dreams. And so I think that there's something to be said about the fact that when we don't allow ourselves to be open, we establish a barrier, that there is us versus them, that there are you versus I, when it really should be us and we, together. And so you don't necessarily lose respect from, students. If anything, you actually gain they gain deeper respect for you and why you're even there in that role to begin with.
Yeah.
But that's just been my experience, honestly.
Yeah. I think I've seen that too. My wife taught classes where she was pregnant and just there was a lot of connection to the classmates when, to her students when they realized, that she was going through a lot that semester, and just the fact that they were able to sort of connect on an emotional level, helped the class. So that's interesting. Ray, can you address a little bit more about caring for the part of the question where the teacher asked about caring for themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an extension of what Krystal was saying about the vulnerability piece. I think, but specifically, I would encourage the instructor to be mindful. So incorporating this idea of mindfulness around what your needs are. When we become self-aware, then we are better able to regulate. And then we can model that for our students. And so with mindfulness, that looks like being able to check in with yourself, to know when you're fatigued, to be able to check in with yourself, to know perhaps when you are feeling overwhelmed. And then, as Krystal was mentioning, being able to acknowledge or verbalize that. It's okay to say that you're not okay. Quite often, though, in our culture, we perpetuate this notion that we have to always be we have to put on the strong face, or we put on the mask. And I think what I heard Krystal saying, and also what's connected to being well as a professor and as a teacher, is being able to recognize your own humanity. We talk about recognizing the humanity in those that we're serving. We have to acknowledge that we are part of that experience. And in doing that, we can show ourselves compassion. We can recognize that it's okay in the midst of a pandemic to not feel all right, and to be challenged in terms of maybe having difficulty thinking clearly, being really aware that as we are moving through this time, there are going to be cognitive and mental health challenges, and being able to check in with ourselves, work through those challenges, and then verbalizing that, hey, we're in this space and we're in this space together, I think will be most helpful for the person who asked that question.
And maybe I'll add an extension to the question, which is just, is there something that this person or people like him or her should try to avoid?
Try to avoid. I think boundaries has been a huge component of what I've been sharing with my clients, my students, and I've been trying to implement for myself. So I would say that I would encourage the instructor to avoid, as they become aware of their own emotional limitations, to avoid those things that might trigger them to feel overwhelmed, fatigued, depressed, anxious. And so that could be inclusive of certain news broadcasts, that could be inclusive of, access to certain environments, that could be being more aware of just the kinds of conversations. What you put in influences what our output can be. And so it's hard to say specifically what not to avoid, because for me, it's going to look a little different. I'll give you an example. For me, I read all of my news as opposed to watching the news. And so, but if someone is in a space where the information that they're receiving as it relates to what's going on in our world, and as it relates to even educating themselves on being the competent teacher or professor, for me, if I'm reading and I need to set a boundary on that, I can kind of move myself away from the newspaper or from my laptop. Whereas if someone else gets their information in another way, that boundary for them might look like turning the TV off. So I think really key to this, though, is knowing yourself. I think as much as we're encouraging we've talked today about having increased awareness around resources and around what to look for developmentally for children. It's also really important to know what to look for in yourself. And knowing yourself then allows you to be a better advocate for yourself and for those you're serving.
Yeah. Could I add on to that, that perfectionism is also a thing. Like I know that I am an achiever and have been deeply socialized to, get good grades and check all the boxes.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about that has to be crushed in this moment, particularly because no one has it all together.
I was gonna say, Krystal,
You
would
know,
you say?
and I think that, go ahead.
I was gonna ask you, would you say that it's this idea of anticipating that we will make mistakes as opposed to?
No, I think
Okay.
that there's a difference between wanting to do something really well versus trying to be perfect. And I think there's something in this pursuit of perfection that is just not human, you know, like, and so I think that it almost encourages vulnerability, because you feel that you have to have it all together. You have to have a mask, you have to smile. And I think especially in this moment of so much increased social media, like presence and consumption, it can really send false messages of how people are actually doing and what is really going on, you know? And so I think that it happens a lot in the educational world as well, particularly for teachers, because depending on the school environment, there can be a sense of competition. And like, this teacher has it all together, all the lesson plans are together, all of this, they never have any issues. In reality, because you've never observed the classroom before, they don't have it all together. Like, they are often disorganized, but that might not be something that they're telling, you know, others. And so I think that there's an importance in being able, and it goes back to vulnerability for sure, and being able to admit what we don't know and what we haven't figured out in this moment, and being okay with it. No one has lived through a global pandemic before. So there's no handbook, you know, to it. And so I think that normally we have a question, we want to fix it. Like, we want a concrete answer. And I think in this moment, we will have to lean in much more to accepting non-closure far more often than not.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm trying to imagine the scenario you gave me about this teacher who seems to have it all together. And maybe they don't. But what if the teacher really does have it all together? What if this other teacher really just has it all together? They're really organized. They're just better than you.
Lord, no, Josh, no, Josh.
How do you face that situation?
My question would be, at what expense?
Okay.
Right. So I think that, so I will say, though this is not a, you know, religious conversation, I'm a person of faith, and my pastor often says that he believes in this idea of people not being a public success and a private failure.
Yeah.
And when he breaks down that line, it's so interesting to hear this concept that you can have it all together professionally, or you can have it all together in whatever lane of the work that you're doing. But what is it costing your mental health? What is it costing your physical health? What is it costing your relationships with your own children, your marriage, your parents? Like, there's so many costs affiliated with trying to be really excellent at what you're doing at times. And so I think that it pushes us to have to create our own definitions of balance, you know, and honestly, your own definition of success. That success for me might mean that I'm 70% in this area, I'm 50% in this area, and I'm actually okay with it. Because if it means that my children don't have time with me and I'm not present with them, I don't care about trying to pursue that award.
Yeah.
I care that they look at me as a parent and say, you were there.
Yeah.
You listened, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's just some food for thought.
Yeah, well, I think this stuck out to me because I actually have this like vivid memory in my childhood where I think I used to have this habit of being like, oh, this person, yeah, sure, they're better at soccer than me, but I'm a better writer than them.
Right. We all have different strengths.
I always had this way of like sort of like making myself just as good as or better than everyone else. And my dad talked to me once, and he was like, you know what? I remember once in my childhood where there was this guy who was just faster than me, and he was better looking than me, and he was just better than me. And the solution wasn't finding a way that I was better than him. The solution was just not comparing and being okay with who I was. You know,
yes.
And I think there's something.
It's true. It's true. we all have unique purpose. We all have gifts and talents. And I think the more we can spend time discovering what those things are and walking in our own purpose is going to allow us to have maximal impact, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's not our job to contrast and compare. It's our job to say, how can I be the best Krystal there is, the best Ray, the best Josh, because there is no other Josh.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. And there's something special about being who you are. And there's people in your life that are yours, you know, in that way. And that's beautiful. I have one question that is very tangential, but I do want to ask it just because it seems someone has the question. And just in case you're able to help them, they say, and then we're going to have to close up because we're going over time. They say, my 15-year-old recently started getting hallucinations and depression. And they just ask, has it been determined that there isn't long-term effects for taking medication at 15? So they're just asking, is it okay to take medication at 15, or are there likely long-term effects for depression and hallucinations? If you're able to answer that question, great. If not, we understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we would need to know more information before I can make like a definitive clinical response. But I can speak generally and say that the medication for more severe mental health concerns like hallucinations, delusions, and those types of experiences, that medication does come with potential side effects. And we do, as clinicians, we do seek to be mindful of the developmental age and the developmental stage that our clients and patients are in, because we know that there can be those long-term impacts. So what I would encourage, I would encourage us to look at all of the different ways that we can treat. Oftentimes there are what we could consider more holistic or non-traditional ways of addressing those types of concerns. I think, though, back to what I said about it being case specific and needing to know a little bit more information, depending upon the severity of the symptoms and the impact of those symptoms on the total experience of the young person. I think sometimes those potential side effects are outweighed by the potential benefit. I think in any context, though, it's a difficult decision to make. I think, though, being able to have open dialogue about it and then being able to have the conversation with the 15-year-old as well. I think it's really important to let the 15-year-old know that their opinion about their care and their treatment matters as it relates to being whole and well, because I think that will impact how the young person functions and their trajectory to improve. I will end by saying that I believe recovery is possible in terms of mental health concerns. And so I believe that we are able to put together a plan and a combination of treatment that can help the person return to optimal functioning. And whatever way we can do that, that minimizes side effects is what I would encourage that parent to do.
Yes. Well, thank you. And I think my takeaway from our conversation is that we're definitely going through a time that is unique and challenging with COVID, with this racial injustice and all of these things going on at the same time. But that there are some, I don't know if the word is benefits, but there's a chance here to be less perfectionistic, to be more vulnerable with the class. So in some ways, there's an open door that we can step through, and this can be a year that actually has some strong benefits for our class. And that's my takeaway. If either of you want to give a brief takeaway, let's hear it, and then we're going to wrap up.
I would add on to what you just said, Josh, in saying that this is an opportunity for us to really step back, reimagine a different reality for our young people, for our society, for parenting, for so many different things, and begin to construct it, but part of it is that we have to recognize that some of the things that we've done so far in terms of systems, policies, and practices, but also mindsets and beliefs, haven't been helpful. They haven't worked, and so part of it is us being able to definitely acknowledge what has worked, but be brutally honest about the need to do something drastically different. I can tell you in context of schools, in 1975, only 1% of our public schools had any type of police presence, let alone any type of formal training around anything related to active shooting. In 2020, nearly 50% of our US public schools are staffed with full-time officers, in addition to lots of reactive trainings around what to do. You know, if we encounter an active shooter situation. And so I think there's something to be said about the fact that these incidents, they're rising, they're increasing. Even how the film discusses suicide, like these are very real, deep issues that we haven't quite fully solved for. And now is an amazing opportunity to dive deeper into really eradicating them at the core.
Thank you. Ray?
Yes, I think this is an opportunity or a season of for us to reset. That's the word that comes to mind for me. I think we've been forced to slow down in many ways, to reevaluate and to reassess and reset what we've been doing to care for ourselves and to care for our communities. And I think that, as you mentioned, once we kind of emerge from this, I think we will have some evidence about what strategies will work better. I think what came up in our conversation and what I saw in the film is that being transparent, being open about what we're experiencing is something that I think we need to take with us into whatever the new norm is going to be. And so I definitely think this is an opportunity for something different to happen. And I think that as a human race, as humans, we're resilient. And I think that despite the difficulty that is happening all around us, I think when we can tap into that resiliency, but can be honest and with a critical lens, I think we will walk away better and stronger. So.
Well, thank you both. It's been a privilege talking with you. Just to remind our viewers to please follow our YouTube channel to receive more of these discussions. We'll be going every night pretty much next week. We won't be going tomorrow, but every other night through Friday, I think. And we look forward to more conversations. You can go to our website to see the full list of conversations. And again, thank you to Krystal and Ray for tonight's conversation.